Hello everybody, Dark Skeleton here, and in this video I'd like to go over some of the Whispers of the Old Gods changes to the classes, and kind of give my predictions about which ones are really getting the most help from the class cards going forward, and this is a few hours before the release, the official release of Whispers of the Old Gods, so we'll have to see how things actually turn out in practice, but this is just before things actually happen. So at the bottom of my list, the classes I kind of feel are getting the most shafted, probably Zoo, or, well not Zoo, but Warlock in general. Because if you look through the cards, they don't really have a lot going for them. A Darkshire Librarian, Cycall cards, sure. If Discard Warlock was ever a thing, that would be pretty good. Renounced Darkness, although that's one of my favorite cards in terms of the set, and I'll be playing it. There's just not a lot of cards which are really impressive, or I think are really going to make it into the next set. I mean, Cho'Gall is probably the best card here, where it's a 7 mana, 7/7, and you get to make your next spell cost health instead of mana, and pretty much you would use that with Siphon Soul. So it's a 3 health Siphon Soul, because you get 3 health back, and really, you don't get the extra 3 health as the effect. I just treat it as a 3 health Siphon Soul, which is super worth it if you need that tempo. But 1 legendary, I don't think that's really enough to justify saying Warlock is super good. Darkshire Councilman is probably a pretty good Zoo card, that's true. But Darkshire Librarian, Renounced Darkness, Spreading Madness, you could even argue Forbidden Ritual and Possessed Villager. Although they're decent cards, I don't even necessarily know if any of them are going to see play in most decks, so Warlock as a class just has a very few cards that are like, wow, you've got to play this. I mean, if you saw the live stream, you know that Forbidden Ritual can be pretty good if you have a way to buff up the cards that turn, like trading in the Spawn of N'Zoth that Death Rattle gives you minions +1/+1, so it's like X mana, get 2 2s, and that's a pretty good combo if you can theoretically pull it off. But Warlock just they're not getting a whole lot overall. And I think Warrior is a step above them, largely because of the new spell Blood to Ichor, which is actually a pretty insane spell. Deal 1 damage to a minion if it survives, summon a 2/2 slime. For 1 mana you can kill off a 1 health minion, but really you want to use it like to trigger an Acolyte of Pain, which could be summon a 2/2 slime, draw a card for 1 mana, which is pretty good. Even better could be like triggering Patrons as like a mini whirlwind effect right there that also gets you a 2/2 slime. Or for execute, you get to damage a minion and then you get to execute it because it's damaged, and you get a 2/2 slime on the back of it. It's a very versatile card, and overall, if you think about the mana costs you're paying, anytime you can get the 2/2 slime is pretty ridiculous. Or at least definitely justified by the mana cost. But the problem with the Warrior in this expansion is a lot of the cards are just kind of pushing that Pirate Synergy deck. N'Zoth's First Mate, okay, it's a 1/1 that gives you a 1/3 hook. So it's a Pirate, and you'd play it in Pirate maybe. But is Pirate going to be good enough? Bloodsail Cultist. If you control a Pirate, give your weapon +1/+1. Great, if you're playing Pirate Warrior. Ravaging Ghoul is pretty good, though, I do have to admit, for patrons. Bloodhoof Brave, not too bad either. Tentacles, Forearms, that's pretty trash. And, you know, overall, Warrior's getting a couple good cards, but not a ton of them, and some are just kind of good, but not, like, really changing the way the game's played. Probably one of the better cards is Ancient Shield Bearer, where if you're playing the Cthulhu control deck, you can gain 10 armor from that, and that is pretty ridiculous. I'll give it that. But that's 1 card for Control Warriors. Nothing else here you would really play in a classic Control Warrior, maybe Ravaging Ghoul. And you would play Ravaging Ghoul in Patrons, that's true, but Patron is losing the 1/3 Taunt Ghoul that explodes, so you're just trading 1 exploding ghoul out for another, really. And then some cards like Blood Warriors are just kind of too situational. So overall, Warrior, they are getting some neat tools, but not much that really is going to fit into current deck archetypes, and not many cards that are so good that justify building a whole new style of deck around them. So that brings us to Hunter. The thing about Hunter is, beyond like the Fiery Bat and maybe on the Hunt, Hunter got hit pretty hard by all of the aggro tools being nerfed. Leper Gnome, Knife Juggler, Mad Scientist, which was really important for hunters to get those traps out. And those being gone, being replaced by Fiery Bat and On the Hunt, basically as a way to deal some damage early. I mean, they're decent cards, true, but really I think where Hunter's going to be at, if it does change dramatically, is going to be this new Death Rattle thing with Forlorn Stalker and Infested Wolf as well. You could even say Princess Huhuran. I mean, obviously that would be played in a Death Rattle Hunter, triggering a Death Rattle effect immediately and developing a 6/5. All that on top of the really late game cards like Call of the Wild points to mid-range or even more kind of late game control Hunter. Something along those lines being pretty decent. But is it going to be enough to really push that archetype where you're playing the Death Rattle gimmick? Kind of hard to know for sure. One thing I will say is that I do like the Giant Sandworm a lot with its Beastchild Wrath combo, being able to essentially clean out your opponent's entire board without taking any damage, and it keeps killing minions off, so you get to clear the entire board, not take any damage, and then attack the face for 10 damage. Maybe people underestimate that a little bit, and remember BGH isn't a thing because it got nerfed to 5 mana, or at least not as much of a thing. So this might be one of those cards that kind of got underestimated by a lot of people. And I'll see if it really works in practice. You could Tundra Rhino and do it, for instance. Okay, so that's Hunter. Will Death Rattle Hunter be a thing? Maybe. If not, then Hunters did get kind of shafted. But Call of the Wild is super good. If you can play like a mid to late game control or mid-range Hunter. That's the question. Next up is Priest, which overall, I think Priest didn't get a whole lot of great tools. I mean, Herald Village is interesting, but probably kind of a niche card and not just going to be dropped into every deck. But most of the good cards that Priest got are, I would say, Cthulhu-styled Priest decks. So Hooded Acolyte, yeah, it's a 3/6 that can buff Cthulhu up, which is pretty good if you're playing Cthulhu Priest. Twilight Darkmender, which is quite crazy if people are rushing you down and you're playing a Cthulhu deck, a 6/5 that restores 10 health to your hero if Cthulhu has 10 or more attack. Those cards are pretty good, and, you know, Darkshire Alchemist isn't too bad either. But really, if you're not playing the Cthulhu deck, it just does feel a little bit weak, doesn't it? Forbidden Shaping is also a pretty good card, I will admit. Summoning a random minion at the mana that you have available to spend on it. Cards like Embrace the Shadows, probably not going to see tons of play. Shadow Word Horror, almost certainly pretty bad as cards. And you do have Shifting Shade, but overall, Priest, it does feel like for it to be most effective in this expansion, should be playing Cthulhu Priest. And that's fine, but that's like, okay, it's one deck archetype. So if Elise starts to fall away for some reason, you know, the classic Elise control Priest that just basically fatigues out your opponent by entombing their minions, then what you'd be left with is Cthulhu Priest, for the most part. Which is fine. It's just that that makes it like one new deck archetype, which is actually probably viable. And next we have Druid, which I'm ranking higher on the list because I think about 2 types of Druid are going to be coming into fruition here. May not be as viable as it seems initially, but Beast Druid has been attempted to be pushed since the Grand Tournament. And now that it has Mark of Yasarj, which is a great card for Beast Druid decks, Adult Grizzly also being pretty good for the same reasons, you might actually see something like a mid-range or aggressive Druid deck that is actually playable. Something that's just kind of tough to remove with Mounted Raptor and cards like that, but then you can finish things off with a Savage Roar just like you always could. You just don't play it with the combo, you just do a straight-up Savage Roar to finish your opponent off. And I definitely see that that could be kind of a thing. The other case would be a Extreme Ramp Druid that's probably playing Cthulhu, but doesn't necessarily have to be. Mire Keeper, basically having that built-in Wild Growth effect, gain an empty mana crystal. Super good. And you can combine that with Fandral Staghelm if you want to play a choose one Druid deck. So you could get a 2/2 Slime here and an empty mana crystal, and with the Druid of the Claw you get a 4/6 charged Haunt Bear, and that's pretty crazy as well. But yeah, one card wouldn't necessarily make the deck. Those are just options that you have if you're going to be playing those ramp druids or the late game druids. Calaxy Amberweaver, I think, is really what makes Cthulhu Druid for me. If you have Cthulhu at 10 attack or more, this becomes a 4 mana 4/10, which is ridiculous. And then cards like Dark Oracle are even pretty solid themselves, being a 6 mana 5/7 taunt that gives Cthulhu a +3/+3 buff on its own. That's pretty good, actually. I mean, a 5/7 taunt for 6 mana is already decent, kind of comparable to something like a Master Jouster or a Sunwalker, but with the Cthulhu buff as well. So, Ramp Druid, maybe a thing. Doesn't necessarily have to play the Cthulhu archetype, but certainly could with a Druid deck. And because Druids have maybe 2 or 3 new kind of decks that they could build, Cthulhu Druid, Ramp Druid that just plays standard Ramp Druid minions, but coming back into the fold with its new refresh on the whole idea. You could even argue choose one Druid maybe, but that probably won't be as much of a thing in itself. And then, yeah, Beast Druid, of course. Druid does seem like it has quite a few potential deck archetypes that are going to go forward with it, so that's why it's kind of in the middle of the list there. Next up, not necessarily with a bunch of new deck types, but with a lot of solid cards, is Mage. So mages are getting Cult Sorcerer for Cthulhu decks, or even arguably maybe just general mage decks, a 3/2 with spell damage on it. Quite good. Shatter for Freeze Mage decks. Freeze Mages did not need much at all, but Shatter is another option for them, basically being that hard removal, so that they don't need to run Polymorph. They didn't really use Polymorph before, but the thing is, Freeze Mages probably had a hard time dealing with 8/8 minions and that sort of thing, because you can't really kill it with a Flame Strike or Blizzard alone. So you'd have to invest a lot of resources into dealing with that. But with Shatter, you can take out those 1 or 2 big minions for 2 extra mana, and that's pretty solid. But then you get into the more mid-range or late-game mage cards. Twilight Flamewalker, Flamecaller. Very good AoE board clear. 1 damage to all enemy minions. It's a 2/2 with a built-in Arcane Explosion. And whenever you combine 2 cards into one like that, it's usually going to be pretty darn good. Pretty darn good, honestly. Kabbalist's Tome. If you want to play a Yogg-Saron mage, or you just want to play a Fatigue mage or a Reno mage, and you want extra power, but you don't want to necessarily draw through your deck, that's a really crazy card. And there's also the potential of Kabbalist's Tome into Kabbalist's Tome for like an infinite chain of cards. Though, I mean, don't rely on getting a second Kabbalist's Tome, but in terms of adding value to your hand and your deck overall, it's pretty dang good. Mage spells, strong in general. Then, for more mid-range tempo-based decks, Servant of Yogg-Saron, if your opponent has a minion on the board and you play this on an empty board on your side of the field, the odds are in your favor that the effect off of this is going to be pretty beneficial for you. So it can be a pretty good card, especially if you're trying to come back on a board. And then Faceless Summoner, probably one of the stronger value cards in this set. A 5/5 that also summons a random 3-cost minion. Kind of expect like 8/8 of stats out of that, spread across 2 minions. Very solid. What I would say, though, is that the new legendary, the Anomalous, is probably not that great. The exception I could see is if you're playing an Emperor Thaurissan Freeze Mage deck, like you freeze the opponent's board with a 2-mana Frost Nova, you play Anomalous, and your opponent has to either polymorph it or lose their whole board the next turn, and basically being forced to not play anything, because anything they play is going to get blown up by Anomalous. So maybe in Freeze Mages, but not much else. Overall, though, I think these cards are really strong for Mage. Kabbalist's Tome, great for Reno Mage. Servant of Yogg-Saron, great for tempo-based mages. Faceless Summoner, great for basically any mage deck that's going to go to turn 6 or more. And then Shatter, just as a good tool for freeze decks. The thing that's hitting Mage the hardest, though, is probably the loss of Mad Scientist, dissuading the use of a lot of secrets. Duplicate's no longer there, but I think Mages would do just fine without secrets at this point. So, especially with new removal tools like, where's the guy? Twilight Flamecaller, having that built-in Arcane Explosion. Or the Cult Sorcerer, which you could play with a spell damage card like an Arcane Explosion or a, I don't know, Arcane Blast. It does give them the ability to get back the early game. it's a couple extra tools that kind of serve similar purposes. So, beyond that, Mage is just looking really strong. Now, maybe I'm rating this a little too highly because I want Rogues to be really good in control style decks, but Rogues are getting a lot of strong tools that can push that kind of archetype. Completely ignoring Bladed Cultist's ability to be a 2-3 minion by comboing with, I don't know, a backstab or anything like that. Basically, Rogue's own personal Zombie Chow in a world where Zombie Chow doesn't exist. You have cards with, like, Journey Below, Discover a Death Rattle minion, which we've seen with Priests is quite insane. And Rogue does have some pretty good Death Rattle minions, such as Undercity Husker. Add a random class card from your opponent's hand. Your opponent's deck to your hand, excuse me. As a 2-mana 2-2, which is kind of like the Rogue's version of the thing that Warlocks have that discovers a card. Shadow Strike, which is a great version of basically Shadow Bolt for Rogues, dealing 5 damage to an undamaged character. Definitely better than Shadow Bolt. Good removal there. And some other cards. Zero Poisoned Blade, just a nice value card in general. But then you get up to big things like Blade of Cthulhu. And if you're going to be playing a control deck, the problem Rogues had was that they didn't really have a lot of good late game minions that you could really justify in a control style decks. But Blade of Cthulhu, especially if you do like Blade of Cthulhu Shadow Step, can really devastate opponent control decks. So you could actually survive that late game. Also, Shadowcaster has some pretty interesting abilities there. Choose a friendly minion, add a 1/1 copy of that to your hand. Could be good if you do Ragnaros with that or something, or even better, Anu Barak. So you add a 1/1 copy of Anu Barak to your hand, you play that, and then Anu Barak gets returned to the hand. Would that make it an 8/4? I don't know. Oh, and Thistle Tea, also. Really good in Fatigue, and by Fatigue, I don't mean mill rogue, I mean really slow rogues that just want to grind out the game. Basically adding 2 cards into your deck and immediately drawing them. Cards like that really make it more viable to outcard your opponent. In general, though, what I see here is that more control rogues are definitely going to be playable. Especially if you like that Cthulhu-style rogue idea. Because if you bladed Cthulhu something huge, remember, that does get added to Cthulhu himself. And if you make like a 24 Cthulhu and you just play that, you probably win the game. So it could be stall until you get Cthulhu and then win. I could see that being a thing. Overall, I just like Rogue a lot, and I think it's going to be pretty solid going forward. So now for the classes that are maybe getting the most Imba card combinations of the set. Paladin, for one thing. With the Divine Shield Paladin idea, it's going to be really strong going forward. A lot of aggro decks are basically going to struggle because they lost Leper Gnome, they lost Knife Juggler. I mean, in the original stat line, they lost those cards. You could still try to play them, but are they actually going to be good? Probably not nearly as much. A 2/2 Knife Juggler or a 1/1 Leper Gnome? Maybe not so great. And in a world where most aggro decks die, if you make one new type of aggro deck and everybody's trying to play control versus control with Cthulhu or something like that, then the aggro deck is just going to like mop the floor with those decks. Yeah, draw as many cards. Stall for Cthulhu as much as you want. I'm just going to play the Divine Shield aggro deck that plays Divine Favor, benefits from you playing the super slow deck, and then crush you. So Selfless Hero, more Divine Shields for your minions. Rallying Blade, buffing up all of your Divine Shield minions so that they do more damage, bake better trades, and are harder to remove. Steward of Darkshire, just give all your 1 health minions Divine Shield as you summon them, and that does include the Paladin hero power. With cards like that, and being able to just play the classic aggro cards for Paladins, I think it's going to be pretty strong. You could even argue Divine Strength isn't bad, but I don't necessarily know that goes in aggro. But yeah, Selfless Hero, Rallying Blade, Steward of Darkshire, and then some of the neutral minions, like the 2-mana 3/1 Stealth Worgen, that might actually be a good fit for this deck. And I think in a world where aggro is rare, this style of deck is going to be super strong. Okay, last up, Shaman, probably the deck that needed and did get the most help with this expansion set. right here you can see Evolve, perhaps one of the strongest cards in the set. Anytime you build a board, let's say of totems, of cards that are the equivalent of Haunted Creep or a Totem Golem. Well, maybe not Totem Golem, you wouldn't really want to transform that. But weak minions or damaged minions or just minions in general, you transform your whole board and you get 1 cost more minions. So not only is it a full heal on your whole board, but it turns minions that are mostly about the effects into minions that can do combat, namely totems. And it does all that for 1 mana, making them stronger minions, healing them, and making them combat ready. I don't know what to say about it other than it's just really insane. Anytime you can build a board as a shaman, you play Evolve, you pretty much win the game, I think. Then, Eternal Sentinel. Way better overload reduction card than Lava Shock. Lava Shock often was like a 0 mana deal 2 damage, but Eternal Sentinel you could just think of as a 2 mana 3/2 always. But when you get to play it after a Lightning Storm or an Elemental Destruction or anything like that, it's like a 0 mana 3/2 or -3 mana 3/2 or the equivalent. If you think of it that way, Eternal Sentinel is just a super, super, super good card. And it really is. Then you look into what else they're getting. Let's see here. Flame Wreathed Faithless. Also great in that Overload style deck. But 7/7 on the 4 mana spot. Really crazy. Your opponent can't BGH as easily because BGH costs 5 mana. So if this hits the board and your opponent doesn't have the polymorph for it, it's going to make a big difference in the game. It's a pretty dang good minion, honestly. I mean, a 6 mana 7/7 is already pretty good, but a minion you can cheat out 2 turns earlier for 7/7 stats? That's crazy. Master of Evolution. Going back to that Evolve effect, but on 1 minion as a battle cry. Transform a friendly minion into one that costs 1 more. You're taking Vanilla Yeti and then giving it a great battle cry effect. Super good minion. Of course you would play that. Halaziel the Ascended. Although Healbot won't be there anymore for Shaman, if you want to nuke the board and go back to full health and you don't want to play Reno, you have Halaziel the Ascended. Great mid-range Shaman card. Hammer of Twilight, another pretty solid weapon. You don't have to play Doom Hammer. You can smack things with Hammer of Twilight and get a free elemental on the back of it. Comparable to, I would say, a true Silver Champion. And definitely worth a 1 more mana cost. So those cards are crazy. Oh, yeah, and here we go. Thing from Below also could push totems to be a lot better. You don't even necessarily have to play a totem deck. Costs 1 less for each totem you've summoned this game. So if you summon 1 totem, it's a 5/5 for 5 mana. If you summon 2 totems, you press your hero power twice this game, it becomes a 4 mana 5/5, which is good. 3 totems, it becomes a 3 mana 5/5. And if you're playing a totem deck, it just becomes ridiculous, because of course you're going to be throwing down like Totem Golems or Mana Tide Totems or cards like that. Just a really solid minion that can be played in any kind of slower Shaman deck, I would say. As long as you're not changing your hero power like Aggro Shaman. Plus, it has Taunt, and that does make a difference. So, you look at Shaman tools, and it's like, oh man, mid-range Shaman is really going to have a comeback here, and I definitely think it will. Out of all the classes, mid-range Shaman was really hard to justify before, but now, an Evolve-style deck, or, you know, just kind of, yeah, I would say definitely an Evolve-style deck. If you're going to play board flooding at all, you're definitely going to be playing those minions, but mid-range Shaman, super strong from the looks of things, and I think it'll be one of the best comeback classes this set. May not be the best deck, but out of all the classes, I feel like Shaman's getting the most help. And it was probably needed, because the only deck people were playing was the Face Shaman before. So, that's about it for my opinions going forward. Given this is all untested, based purely on speculation, so as soon as Old Gods hits for real, feel free to come back and tell me how wrong I was, because surely I missed the mark on a couple things. But hey, all just for fun. So thanks for watching. I've been Dark Skeleton, and until my next video, I guess I'll see you then.